afternoon, or evening, depending on the time of day. You are tuning in to part 2 of our Chapter 4 lecture that I have entitled Scared of the Dark. We are going to be moving on to the third of our chapter focus questions, the founding of the Middle Colonies. And we are going to be trying to figure out how the Middle Colonies were founded, how the founding and settlement of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania differed from the founding and settlement of New York. I'm sorry, of New England. So again, we are going to be doing some comparison, and that is one of the big themes of this New World for All, is that this entire unit talking about how it was new worlds, various new worlds in each of the different colonies and each of the different empires for all of the different groups of Native Americans and Europeans involved in colonization. So let's jump right into the content today. Um, the one of the problems that this is going to kind of I'll back up a second here. The colonies of the empire. This fourth focus question, all of these focused questions of these chapter questions kind of come together to show us a bigger picture. So that's kind of important to keep in mind as well. Explain how the English monarchy moved to consolidate its authority over the American colonies. And this section here on the founding of the Middle Colonies kind of gives us an inkling into the spiraling out of control that was going on with these unruly British colonies. King Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York, had hoped to build an empire in America by expanding into the mid Atlantic. So at this point in time, we have colonies in the Chesapeake region. The Carolinas are getting off their feet, but we also have these colonies in the north in New England. And so these two are looking to fill in and unify the British colonies, connect them all. This would allow more defense, more unity, more trade. And the proprietary system that they had been operating under had become somewhat of a liability. Many separate surrenders rather than a unified collective defense was one of the ways that the system had been described. And they were looking at, transforming these into some crown colonies. And this was their attempt, but this did not work. The colonies, their attempts to kind of fill in and unify the British colonies and did not work. The colonies are going to continue to be diverse, unorganized, despite the Crown's best efforts. So when we look at the Mid-Atlantic colonies, what exactly are we talking about? The Mid-Atlantic is how I like to describe it, the middle colonies. So when we look at them, they were more fertile, more tempered than New England, but far healthier than the Chesapeake region. There is one of the good things about, and one of the things that's really important for us to understand, is the best way to navigate. And we talked a little bit about this in the Chesapeake lecture. The best way to navigate, to move around, to trade was on a river system. It's much easier to push something through water than it is to pull it across land. So these three deep navigable rivers, the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson River, all are going to make the mid-Atlantic colonies, the middle colonies, very attractive. So the English neglect of this region initially is going to enable the Dutch and Swedish people to establish their own small colonies there. And we talked about these way back, I believe, in week 2. So we have the New Netherland in the Hudson River Valley and New Sweden in the Delaware Valley. So that's kind of what we're looking at this point in time. So when we look at New Netherland, to how we see New Netherland, which is, here, transforming into New York. In 1926, a guy named Peter Minute, he was the resident director of the West India Company. He's going to purchase Manhattan Island in its entirety from the Manhattan people for trade goods worth about the equivalent of a dozen beaver pelts. So it's a heck of a buy and a scam on the Native Americans. But New Amsterdam is on Manhattan Island is going to become the principal trading center in New Netherland and the colony's headquarters. But unlike in the English colonies, both in the Chesapeake and in the North, New Netherland is not going to attract many European immigrants. So New Netherlanders are going to be the ones who do come are going to be remarkably diverse, especially in their religion, compared with the homogeneous British English settlers to the north and the south. So the West India Company is going to struggle to govern the motley colonists, and they never are going to permit settlers to form a representative government. So that's one of the things that's going to be major different because we saw um, representation in the north, we had representation in the south, but we're not seeing it here in these initial colonies that are not a part of the British colonies. In 1664, New Netherland is going to become New York after King Charles II is going to give it to his brother, James, Duke of York. And as the new proprietor of the colony, the Duke of York is going to exercise almost the same unlimited authority over the colony as the West India Company had done. So, although the Duke is going to permit religious toleration in the colony, the policy is less of an affirmation of liberty or of conscience, is more of a recognition of the reality that New York is the most heterogeneous, the most diverse colony in 17th century North America. So it had to be religiously tolerant, else it was going to lose all of its settlers. It was just it was by necessity, not by design or by like some type of moral or ethical code that we see this religious toleration blooming. Now, in New Jersey and New Pennsylvania, the creation of New York is actually going to indirectly lead us to the founding of New Jersey and Pennsylvania colonies. In 1664, the Duke of York is going to subdivide his grant and give a portion of the land between the Hudson and the Delaware to two of his friends. You know, I always do that to all of my friends, give them big portions of land just for being great, great people. So this new colony, it was going to be called New Jersey. And then um, Pennsylvania is going to be formed whenever William Penn, who is a very prominent English Quaker, is brought in to arbitrate a dispute between proprietors. And Sen, Penn, is going to settle the dispute. And in the process, he becomes interested in establishing a Quaker colony in America. Now, William Penn is a Quaker. We'll get into that in a second. But if you think back to part one of this lecture, they had been hanging and branding Quakers in New England. So it was not like that was a great place to migrate to. So the Quakers are kind of lost. So the Quaker concept of an open, generous God who made his love equally available to all people is going to be what brings the Quakers into conflict with the English government. But Penn is a pretty smart guy. He remains on really good terms with Charles II, and Charles II is going to grant him land to found a Quaker colony in America. Now, partly this is, again, just realistic. Back in it was going to get rid of the Quakers in England. He's like, yeah, if we can give the Quakers somewhere else to go, they'll get out of my hair in England. And Charles then makes Penn the proprietor of a new colony called Pennsylvania. And I want to go back and remind you when we talked about in chapter 2, New Worlds for All, I said that it also creates New Europe because it gives them a place to dump this unwanted population. They're like, yeah, we don't want you religious weirdos. Get out of here. So this is one of those things where, like, well, if we can give the Quakers somewhere to go, they will get out and we don't have to deal with them here. So it's a way of preventing religious strife in the British Isles was to allow these religious dissidents, these people who they saw as devious, a place to go. So when we look at in 1682, Pennsylvania being formed for the Quakers' delight, and there's a really great parody video that I'll put in a recommended link for you. But what is a Quaker? A Quaker is, or what do they think? But one of the things they think is that all people are equal before God. Now, this is very different from the Puritans, so that's important to kind of keep in mind. They had that concept of the elect, that some people were chosen for hell and some people were chosen for heaven. Some people were the elect and others were not. But in the Quaker mentality, everyone is equal before God. They wore very plain clothes. They refused to take oaths of allegiance. They rejected having to pay a church or rejecting making payments to a church. They saw everyone in kind of an equal manner. So they kind of refused to address the hierarchy in society, to allow aristocratic kind of ideals, that there was a some people who are better than others. And they also are pacifist, refusing to bear arms, not wanting to fight, to turn the other cheek, so to speak. And the other thing that's going to be one of the major Quaker legacies in America is that they dislike slavery. So they are going to become, and they're Pennsylvania, going to be settled right at right to the north of the South. So that's going to come as we move forward. There's this strong Quaker ideology in Pennsylvania that's really going to influence that colony, but also all of American kind of political thought as it develops over time. Now, another thing that we're going to see, if you look at the down the line towards the women movement, a lot of Quakers taught their children, both male and female, equally. So they kind of had an equality of gender in their mind as well. So it's in the 1660s that William Penn is going to become a Quaker, and he become a moderate Quaker, and he heavily influences the movement to become more moderate, but in the and to become more accepting and more tolerant and more diverse, more diversity. Now, a lot of times when I show people this image, the students are like, "Ah, that looks like the guy on the Quaker Oats container." Well, that is him. Quaker Oats, one of the things about Pennsylvania that is often called the breadbasket of America because there's so much agriculture taking place there, growing a lot of bread, growing a lot of oats, growing lots of grain. And that is kind of there based on that legacy. So when we look at this toleration and diversity of Pennsylvania, the Quakers, who are mostly artisan farmers, laborers, not a lot of aristocrats, are going to flock from Pennsylvania, and not just from England, but England, Ireland, Wales, and also the European continent, so the larger European continent. And one of the things that's going to make them more tolerant and more diverse, because you have to be able to live with all of those different cultures together. One of William Penn's grand legacies was dealing with the neighboring Native Americans fairly. And he is going to be called Brother Onas, Onas. And this is kind of a, 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 a nickname, a title that they give him that really shows how well they think that he's a very fair man. Now, despite its, I should say, Pennsylvania is going to tolerate all Protestant sects as well as Roman Catholicism. But it is a Quaker colony, despite its toleration, despite its diversity. It's a Quaker colony, as much as New England became a stronghold of Puritanism. And Penn is going to use the civil government to enforce religious morality. So he's going to have, there's going to be certain moral and civic codes that are reflected of Quaker values, even though you were allowed to be any kind of religion you wanted, but the laws reflected Quaker values. That's important to remember as well. Now, as the proprietor, Penn had extensive powers that were subject to review only by the king. And so and Penn is also going to stress that the exact form of government matters less than the men who served it. So, although we see this is not a representative democracy at this point, Penn having a lot of power, he's like, as long as it's a fair man, it doesn't matter what kind of government it is. But of course, that's not always how it goes, right? And what's fair is not always clear and not always the same in everyone's eyes. So, moving on in this chapter, talking about the fourth chapter question, the colonies and the empire, and then we are going to be looking to explain how the English monarchy tried to consolidate its authority over the American colonies. Okay, what does that mean exactly? How did the crown try to control the colonies? They basically think the colonies are unruly. They have too much power. They don't like this representative democracy too much. What can they do? And they want to figure out, how can we consolidate our authority? How can we gain power? How can we gain control over the colonies in America? And oftentimes, like if you've ever been a babysitter before, if you have younger brothers and sisters, you can't start out really lax. You have to start out and be pretty firm. Because if you start out and everybody can do whatever they want to, it's really hard to get that back under control. So this is a similar thing. They have a hard road to hoe in order to consolidate their authority. So when we started talking about the colonies, and one of the ways that the British had always and the English had always tried to control things was through trade. The English are an economic people, and that it always had been a commercial empire, an economic empire. So English economic policies towards the colonies were designed to yield customs revenue, tax revenue, for the monarch, for the crown, and profitable business for English merchants and shippers. And as we talked about, the Navigation Act, starting in 1650 and all the way through 1663, are going to set forth fundamental regulations over governing trade. Number one being all colonial goods imported into England had to be imported on English ship, and certain colonial goods could only be shipped to England or to other English colonies. Now, all the money that all this is bringing in is going to support the growing British Navy and the British shipping business. So, it have one of the things that I always kind of, as part of this class, you have to have money to make money. And this money that they have invested in their colonies is used to make them more money. So, colonial commerce is defined by regulations. By the end of the 17th century, colonial commerce is defined by regulations that subjects merchants and shippers to royal supervision. It's going to give the crown control and access to all the different markets, all the different trading that's going on all throughout the British Empire. So that's a big deal. That's all that's kind of like what's going on here. But as we are going to see, um, the King Philip's War, which is going to be our next topic, is going to um, kind of continue to point out to the crown that they don't have that much control. So, when we talk about King Philip's War, how does this give us a consolidation of royal authority? Well, in 1675, King Philip's War is going to start. It's going to erupt. And it's going to be brought about by skirmishes in the Connecticut River Valley that are going to happen in the 1630s, and they are going to culminate in the Pequot War. The Pequot War. And in the decades that followed in the 1630s, the New Englanders are going to maintain peace with the very powerful Wampanoags and the other surrounding Native Americans. But the New Englanders are going to have that, steady growth through natural growth, which we talked way back in the first half of this lecture. And they're also going to have immigration, but they are going to steadily encroach on Indian land. And that is going to bring us to war in 1675. This is known as King Philip's War, and the colonists are eventually going to emerge as triumphant. One of the legacies of this war is that it leaves New Englanders with a very enduring hatred of Native Americans and a large war debt and a very devastated frontier. This was a widespread, very bloody war. And actually, it is the bloodiest war in American history when we go by percentages of people who died. And is really a war that is characterized by terrible mutilations, terrible burning, treating prisoners very badly, hanging carcasses in the streets. It was a very, very rough, disgusting time period. Um, but so their frontier settlements are completely wiped out. They've got a huge debt from the war, and the crown is like, "What is going on? This is not going well. This isn't making us money. What's going on here?" Because remember, from the crown's perspective, that's what the colonies are supposed to do. So a royal investigation is going to be launched, and concludes that the New England colonists have deviated from English rules, and as a consequence, the crown is like, you know what, we've got to govern New England more directly. And in 1684, an English court is going to revoke the Massachusetts charter, and 2 years later, royal officials are going to incorporate Massachusetts and the other colonies north of Maryland into what they call the Dominion of New England, and that is going to be governed by Sir Edmund Andros. So, this is a huge assertion of British colonial power by the crown. Now, this is going to cause a lot of resistance. People are going to be very upset about this, and there's going to be a lot of resistance. Now, this is why all politics are local, but they are also international. So in England in 1688, the Glorious Revolution is going to reassert Protestant power, and So essentially what happens is we see the parliament is going to kick out the existing king and queen and invite new Protestant king and queen into the to take the crown. And that's a very confusing topic, and it's all to do with the English Civil War that's kind of going on, and the Protestants versus Catholics. And but what we see is a forcible, glorious, bloodless revolution that's going to take place in England that is going to result in Protestants being in power. And it's also going to embolden these colonial uprisings against royal authority in the colonies of New York, Massachusetts, and in Maryland. Now, the colonists are going to destroy the Dominion of New England, overthrow Andros, and reestablish the former charter governments in both Massachusetts and New York. Maryland had never lost its charter, but it's going to go through its own series of changes here. Now, these rebel governments are not going to last long, and the crown soon does reestablish royal control of the colonies. And Massachusetts is going to become a royal colony with its governor being appointed by the king. And it's going to come with some other unsettling changes that are going to bring about new laws and qualifications for voting. Landowners, rather than church members, could vote in county-wide elections. But as much as the colonists are kind of upset and angry about the crown's control, they still are happy that they have the English protection from hostile neighbors, the Spanish, the French, as well as Native Americans. And the British are a very, very powerful force on the seas these days. So they're very excited about that. So that is something that they are happy to have, that they are going to have this protection. And that's one of the major benefits of remaining within the British Empire. And here you can see the crest that's going to be of this new government. So that brings us, there's drawbacks and benefits with this royal control. But we see it's becoming less, it's going to kind of force the New England government to become less religious. So when we start looking at comparing New England and the Chesapeake, which is kind of going back to the first half of this chapter, neither is going to work the way the crown intended. The crown is going to try to exert control over them, but can't the way they want. And we see representative governments are going to occur in both places. And this is also true of the middle colonies. As time goes on, the middle colonies are going to start to have many of these same similarities. But there are a lot of differences. New England is a much healthier place to live. It's a much more organized society. And even though we tend to think of the Puritans moving to America to have religious freedom, there's arguably much more religious freedom in the Chesapeake region because there's no churches to control anyone. Nobody is particularly religious. There's a lot more diversity, and that is going to be especially true as we see Pennsylvania coming in, seeing that religious diversity and toleration there as well. In the Chesapeake, large plantations are going to develop cash crops, and because of that, we see uh, society really spread out among these huge farms. But the North is based on small farms and shipping, so the population is much more dense. Another thing that happens with this is that there is this Americanization process that is happening. That is one of the things that was pointed out to the Crown after the tragedies, of King Philip's War, is that the Americans are becoming very different from the people that are in England. And just within the course of a very few generations, they are very diverse. There's a lot more religious diversity. There's a lot more ideological diversity. There is more people from other colonies, because once the Swiss and the Dutch, their governments might hand over the keys to the new colony, but the people that live there are still there. So there is differences in culture, there's difference in religion, there's difference in nationality, and they have these representative governments that are allowing them to have a say in their, much more so than they would in England. There's more political participation because people are having more of a say in these representative governments. Also, Americans are going to have a better diet. There's better supply of food, more protein, more meat, um, and more food available in general, especially as the colonies get more established. Americans also have higher birth rates. There's much more room to expand. You can have more children. There's continuous growth going on, expansion. That's something that wasn't happening in England itself. We also, again, have that mix of cultures and the log cabin, thatched roofs. They're all going to kind of be blended together in America. So we do see, even in this early period of time, in the 1600s, we're seeing a very different population, an Americanization process taking place. And partly, if you think about it, it's all the religious dissonance, if all the political difference, and people are coming there for opportunity, they are going to be different. So, than the people who stayed in England. So it is a natural evolution. And as time goes on, we're going to see this evolution continue, even though there is a very strong bond between the colonies and England, the mother country. And as I said, it's a bond that has both benefits and drawbacks. So when we go to conclude this lecture, the kind of important points to kind of remember here: the role of religion in New England migration, settlement, society, life, and government. The Indian conflicts, especially with King Philip's War, are crucial to the physical, social, and cultural development of New England and to all the British American colonies. And at the same time, the North, the South, and the Middle colonies, too, I don't have them on here, but I should, are developing very differently and very unruly, not at all in the way the Crown had expected. And we are seeing a new formation of a new type of colony, the proprietary colony, and that this Americanization is occurring everywhere, despite the differences between colonies. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please put them in the comment section down below. I'll remind you that, again, this is a closed lecture. No one can see it. That's not in this class, so it's not something you have to worry about the whole world seeing. It's just for our class. If you don't want to discuss it with the class here, I would love to have you write to me in an email or see me on the discussion boards. I look forward to hearing from you. I hope everyone is staying safe and happy and healthy.